it's impossible for me to answer that question. I'm afraid I can't recall that. And I don't recall that either, I'm afraid.
Does that mean yes or no?
It means I can't answer your question. I'm not a cement engineer, I'm afraid. That was a decision I was not party to.
That's Tony Hayward, and there are a lot of things you can say to the man after that testimony. One of them probably shouldn't be, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I am not a cement engineer either, but Top Line begins right now.
Hello and welcome to ABC Washington Post Top Line. I'm Rick Klein.
And I'm Jonathan Karl.
Every day at noon Eastern, we're right here bringing you the latest political news and analysis, pretending to be at least political experts, if not soccer experts or cement engineers or anything else. And it's twitter.com/thenote for even more. John, big day on the Hill yesterday. What do you think?
So sorry. Now, Rick, as memorable as Joe Barton's apology to BP was, I've got to say that his apology for apologizing was actually more memorable. Take a look.
If anything I've said this morning has been misconstrued in an opposite effect, I want to apologize for that misconstruction.
It was certainly a misconstruction, and that apology, the second one, came after, as you know, a threat from the Republican leadership. You take that back, or you lose your status on that committee.
Democrats pounced, including the White House. Republicans weren't there to defend him. This was exactly the wrong storyline for Republicans. You don't want to create any villains in that room other than Tony Hayward, who was doing a pretty good job on his own.
Good job, yeah.
Next up, unstimulated. President Obama is in Ohio today touting the effects of the stimulus bill as he'll be doing throughout the country over the summer. But back on Capitol Hill, there isn't really an appetite for any additional spending. He wants more spending, some $24 billion on money to go to states. He wants additional unemployment benefits, but there is sticker shock settling in on Capitol Hill. Democrats as well as Republicans saying we just don't want to see any more spending. This is going to be the reality from here through the election.
And Rick, have you seen today the state-by-state unemployment figures that are out now? Guess what happened? Michigan now, for the first time in a long time, is no longer the highest unemployment rate in the country. It is Nevada.
Oh, wow. Good. Well,
so I think Harry Reid's got some interest here in getting this thing on track.
Well pronounced.
Thank you very much. And now it's a tax. And it's official that it's a tax. This is about the health care bill's mandate. The Obama administration has now officially said that it is, in fact, a tax. This comes in the court filing in response to that lawsuit by the 20 Republican attorneys general challenging the constitutionality of the mandate. And the administration now, the DOJ, is saying that it is constitutional. It's in the power of the government to tax.
Don't forget that, President Obama would not raise your taxes by one dime. So this is a tough, it's a legal position. It's going to be tough for the administration to explain how it is a tax, but it isn't a tax.
Because throughout that health care debate, they were saying it was not a tax.
Not a tax. Not a tax. Well, now it's on paper. And finally, green lighted. Democrats are going to be stuck with Alvin Green in South Carolina. Democratic Party officials there last night voted not to hold another round of balloting because they didn't find any evidence that anything of actual fraud in the election. And so he's going to be there, and Democrats are hoping this is the last time we talk about him. Something tells me that he's going to make his way into another headline.
You know, that Jim DeMint race is a big one down there.
A big one indeed, and Alvin Green is the guy. We're joined now by a good friend of the program, Chris Van Hollen, a Democratic congressman from Maryland and chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. Thank you for being here, Mr. Chairman. And I want to start
Good to be with you.
I want to start with the fallout from Joe Barton. He apologized last night for his apology earlier in the day. Do you take that at face value? Is that the end of this?
No, it's not the end of this. We heard what his statement was right at the outset. That was heartfelt. That's what he believes. And Joe Barton is not just any Republican. You know, the Republicans are trying to take back control of the House. He would be in charge of the Republican energy policy. So the guy who was apologizing to BP, the guy who was saying that the fund that's created to help millions of victims is a slush fund, that's the guy who's going to be in charge of the Republicans' energy policy if they were to take back the House. It once again makes our point that you don't want to give the keys to the car back to the guys who got us into such a mess to begin with. And I would also point out, he doesn't stand alone. People have not paid nearly as much attention to the Republican Study Group statement. Includes 119 members of the Republican House Caucus that also called this deal a shakedown. So you got the guy who's in charge of the House energy policy for the Republicans, and you got a huge number of members of his caucus feeling the same way.
Okay, so level with us on this. I know you're outraged by Congressman Barton's statement, but how thrilled were you when you heard him say it?
Well, I will say we were surprised. I mean, because I know where
it was
the
a political gift,
is,
right?
I know where the policy is on the Republican side. They've always been very close to the big oil companies and the oil industry. We know that, but you usually don't hear them say it out loud. And what that was a very revealing moment where someone, in a moment of great passion and truth-telling, said publicly what we all know is their policy privately. And that policy was reflected in, the Republican Study Committee statement. So it was a surprise, because usually they try and hide the fact that they are essentially the guys who are on the side of the big oil corporations.
Mr. Van Hollen, I want to ask you about a bill that you helped write, the Disclose Act, which is the response to the Citizens United. It would do a lot toward disclosure of campaign finance donations and some of the big groups that get involved. It's come under a lot of criticism because of a carve-out that would affect the NRA, among other groups. Can you try to explain to us why this was part of this, why this is good policy? I mean, isn't this really sleeping with the enemy to try to get something done to allow the NRA to continue to spend money outside of the disclosure requirements?
A couple points. First of all, this legislation, the disclosed legislation, will create an unparalleled amount of transparency and accountability in terms of giving the voters the right to know who is paying for these campaign commercials, number one. Number two, the groups we're really worried about are the groups that pop up overnight with shadowy names, a fund for the better American future, and don't have to disclose who their donors are, because they are the ones who are most likely to mislead voters as to their true identity. We are less worried about large established groups with millions of dues-paying members. Now, I would have preferred to have everybody in, but the AARP, the NRA, with the other changes, the Sierra Club and others, which are well known to Americans because they have a big national base, are not the kind of groups that are going to be fooling people when they're running ads. People know who they are and what they stand for. We're really most worried about those ads that are going up there, making statements, and nobody can hold anybody accountable for what's going on.
I mean, come on, though. This is a situation where you're picking and choosing which special interest groups get to be exempted from this. It seems to be entirely against the spirit of what you're trying to do with this bill.
Well, again, there are different levels of membership, and those reflect the extent to which groups are known to the American people and therefore are not going to fool the American people when they run an ad. Look, I'm not going to kid you. I put this bill in without any exceptions. I would have preferred to get it done that way. But around here, the key thing is to get this bill passed, because even with these changes, it will be a historic amount of disclosure. In other words, if you don't pass this bill, corporations can spend unlimited amounts of money on ads and you'll never know who they are. I mean, a BP, for example, could set up a nice sounding fund, the Fund for America's Future, right, and run ads, and no one would ever know that BP had paid for them. And one of the important parts of this bill is to make sure that foreign controlled interests can't spend unlimited amounts of money in U.S. campaigns, because the Supreme Court decision opened the floodgates. Right. So if you're asking me whether I would prefer a bill with no exceptions, the answer is yes. That's how it was introduced. But it is very important that we get this bill passed, and we think that there's minimal damage when organizations that are well known to the American people, who everyone knows what they stand for, whether you're for them or against them, they're not the types of groups that are fooling people as to who they are.
I want to ask you about some politics. There was an NPR poll out earlier this week that looked at 70 targeted districts across the country, and it showed a Republican advantage, even including names on the ballot, of 8 points. It's a big margin in these districts, and really come to the conclusion that you've got to run against Washington. I think we've known that for some time, but how are you going to overcome that? That is a big gap when you look at these targeted the districts that will determine the majority.
Well, we've seen these polls bump up and down over a period of time. It's a very unsettled electorate. We know that. But as what you pointed out is the case, which is that while people are not satisfied with the direction of the country, and frankly, until we get totally out of this economic ditch, no one's going to be satisfied. The president's not satisfied. The Congress isn't satisfied. But you always have to ask the voters, what's the other guy's plan for moving this country forward? And when you look at what the Republican proposals are and what Republican candidates are proposing, it is essentially the same economic agenda that got us into this mess to begin with. Their number one economic policy priority is another tax cut for the wealthiest people in America, to restore the Bush tax cuts for the people at the top. That is their solution to our economic situation, and we all know that will only dig us deeper into the hole.
All right, Chris Van Hollen, Democrat of Maryland, chairman of the DCCC. Thanks for being here.
Good to be with you.
Really appreciate it. That's going to be a big fight next week to see what happens with the Disclose Act.